Okay, in this video, we're going to be going through basically getting you set up on Git and GitHub, and getting GitHub to talk with RStudio and RStudio to talk with GitHub. And so just to clarify a few terms, I guess, Git is the software, right? So that's the actual software that's doing the tracking in the background. So that's what's keeping track of the changes of your files, what you're storing, what you're staging, what the previous versions are. And GitHub is a website, basically. It's a website that allows you to store your GitHub repositories there so that it acts as your remote server, right? So you have Git on your local computer doing the actual work, and GitHub online that has some really cool features. But it basically it's there to act as your remote server. And in my opinion, this is kind of the most difficult part of using Git and GitHub, because you have to do some things that maybe you haven't done before necessarily. If you're a biologist coming from kind of a standard biology background, these are tools built by software developers. So once you get past this hurdle of getting everything set up, it's actually pretty straightforward and relatively simple to start using. So hopefully at the end of this video, you'll have your computer all set up, you'll have a GitHub account, and RStudio will be working seamlessly with Git and talking with GitHub, but no problems. So this repository that I created will actually be available to you. I'll have a link, and then also the files will just be there as separate files in the main course folders. But so we're following through here on section 2, how to get started. And this README file basically outlines everything. So if you need to go back, if you think I didn't do a great job explaining it out loud, you can go back, and there are some links in here too to help you through. So Git typically comes already installed if you have a relatively up-to-date system, but it can't hurt to update if you're not sure. Or just, I don't know, if you want to check to make sure that it's all downloaded and installed. So if you click this link, git-scm.com, that takes you to the main Git website, and you can download for whichever system you're using. I'm using Mac, and I've already done this. Git's already installed on my computer, so if you need to do that, just pause right now, go through the installation, and then once you're fully installed, then come back and join us again. So, assuming that Git is working cleanly, that it's fully installed, you're now actually already set to use Git locally, right? So you won't necessarily have the benefit of working with a remote repository yet, but you can have your own local copy of a version database running with Git at this point. Like I mentioned, the remote server that we're going to be using, the website is github.com. Right, so it's github.com. There's some other ones that are pretty commonly used, like Bitbucket, that I've used before, and each one has its upsides and its downsides. But GitHub really has a large user base, and so you should definitely have a presence on GitHub, even if you also use Bitbucket or whatever for various projects. It's definitely worth being on GitHub. And so you can create an account for free. So if you go to github.com, I'm actually going to sign out to show you. So if you go to github.com, you just pick a username, type in your email, pick a password, and you can sign up for GitHub. Right. So once you're signed up and signed in, you'll have this kind of login screen. And one thing I should note when you're picking a username is that it's a good idea to have it relatively professional, I guess, and kind of related to your real name helps. So just keep that in mind. You can always change it. You can always create a new profile, but you might as well think about how you might use this in the future. from the start. So back to our README. Once you've created your GitHub account, you're ready to start working on getting RStudio set up. So you should all, I believe, have RStudio already. If not, you can download it for free. If you need to do that, download that now and come back. Once you have RStudio installed, here's actually the same thing. There are a couple of things that you'll need to do to actually get it set up for working with Git. You probably do not have this button here that says Git or version control, and in your pane that has environment and history and well, it probably doesn't have Git. It will have Git by the time you get it fully set up. So to configure RStudio, sorry if this is a little bit confusing going back and forth between these two screens. The first thing you want to do is go up to the Tools menu and go into your global options. All right, so that's up here. I'm going to go to Tools. It might be a little bit different if you're on Linux or Windows, but you should still have these same menus to choose from somewhere. And in the global options, you have these icons along the left, and there should be one that says Git/SVN. Those are two different kinds of version control systems. So Subversion or SVN is just another alternative to Git. We're not going to deal with that. We're just going to use Git. So if you click on that, you should make sure that you check the box for Enable Version Control Interface for RStudio projects. So this by default is not checked, but once you check that, you should get some more options. It will likely just find the Git executable, so that's basically the code to actually run Git. That should just be filled out by default. Some of you might have a box for use Git bash as shell for Git projects. That might just be something that shows up on Windows, I think. I'm not 100% sure about that, but if you have that box, go ahead and check that. So use Git bash as shell for Git projects. What that means is that for a Git project, when you need to write on the command line, that's going to use the Git shell, the Git version of the command line, rather than the kind of system default. And then to actually see the changes, you're going to need to close out of RStudio and open back up. Right, so go ahead and X out of RStudio. And when you open it back up, you should be able to see all of these different menus, right? So you should have this Git drop-down menu, and you should have this tab somewhere. The arrangement of your panels might be different than what I have here, but wherever you have environment and history, you should now have Git. So, assuming that you have that set up, we're going to do a couple of things to make things easier for you in the long run. Right, so this should be the only time you need to actually work from the command line. And so what we're going to do is if you go to the Git tab down here, you have this little gear wheel that says More. If you click on that, then we have this option for shell ... And this basically opens up a window where you can run lines of code from the command line. So not through R, but through your actual system command line. So once you click on that, you'll get this window. For some reason, mine always likes to open up two. It doesn't matter, you can close out one of them. You just need one of them. And it should look something like this. Depending on your system and your setup, it'll be a little bit different. And what we're doing here basically is telling your computer what your GitHub account information is. And so here, you can for the username, you can actually use either your GitHub username or your real name. It doesn't really make a difference. But this is the name that should show up when you make commits. So one of those two, something that is easily identifiable as you. So what we're going to do here is we're going to type, let me make this a little bit bigger. We're going to type git config -- global, right? So we're saying git, so this first one, this first word git basically tells your computer that you're typing for Git. We're going to configure the global options. And then the global option that we're changing first is user.name. And then in quotes, you can type in your name. So I can do Tim Sepchek. And then you hit enter and you won't actually see anything. It's just like in R when you run a line of code. If it's not explicitly producing output, you won't see any output. So unless you get an error message, you can assume that it did what it was supposed to. Right, so we've just set up our username, and then we're going to also set up our email. So I'm going to type git config again, -- global, and then user.email, and then type in your email address. So mine is a Gmail account, and this is the email address that you have your GitHub account set up with. You might have used your UNH email. If you haven't, you should go ahead and connect that also. There's an option in the settings where you can add a secondary email account, because one cool thing that GitHub does is they have private repos and public repos, where public repos obviously are public, everyone can see them. Private repos, it's just you and whoever you invite to collaborate with you. And those generally cost money through GitHub, but if you have a .edu email, they'll give you a certain number for free. And so you can go ahead and connect your UNH email address if that's not what you used. Right, so here we're going to set the user email. Again, we hit enter and you don't see any output, but that's okay. So that should be it from the command line, at least for the moment. So once you've done that, Git knows what your name is and Git knows what your email address is. Right, so we can close out of terminal or your shell, whatever you're using. And next, we're going to go through how to actually create a repository. And here there are actually, I guess you might expect, there are a lot of different ways of doing this. This way that I'm going to go through is, I think, the easiest way to do it. So this is specifically creating a Git repository that is an RStudio project. Right, so Git repositories don't have to have anything to do with R or RStudio, but most of the projects that you would probably create that have a Git repository would also have R code, and so it makes sense to do things through RStudio. So the first step, we want to open up GitHub, right? So if you go to github.com in your browser, you should have this little plus sign somewhere. And if you click on that, we can select New Repository. All right, so we click on this and we get this screen. It should show your username right here. So mine is sz-tim. And then here we get to write in what we want our repository name to be. Right, and they give you suggestions here. So you could call it bookish-octo-dollop. For our purposes, let's stick with like test repo or something similar like that. So I'm going to call this test repo. You're welcome to add in a description if you want to. This is, as it says, optional. And then you likely have this option of public versus private. We can just keep it public for now. It doesn't really matter. And then down here, we have a few extra options. Right, so keep scrolling down here. And generally, it's a good idea to initialize with a README. This basically creates a file that you can use as sort of a first screen introduction or an overview. You can make it as detailed as you want, so it could say nothing. It could just say like, this is my test project, or it could go into detail about what's in each folder, kind of what the overall goal of the project is. It's a nice place to kind of get your mind organized and create kind of like a splash screen, so that if someone finds your repo, they can really quickly just look at your README and kind of get an idea of what the repository looks like and what's in it. These other two options, you have the option of adding a .gitignore file, and this is basically just a file that tells Git what it should not pay attention to. Right, so Git is keeping track of all the files within your folder, except for the ones you say not to. And if you scroll down, you can actually select R, since we're creating an R project. And that basically just sets it to some of the default files that R creates that you don't necessarily want to track, like some of the things that happened in the background. And you're also welcome to create some kind of license. It doesn't really matter if you want someone to, if you want to have guidelines for how someone can use your work, use your repository. So once we have that set up, we can click Create Repository, and you should get this page, right? So if you look at the URL, we're at github.com/whatever your username is /test repo, or whatever you decided to call your repository. And we can see right now that our repo has 3 different files in it, right? So we have our .gitignore file, we have a license file, if you decided to create both of those, and then we have our README file. If you don't see this, then go back and try again, I guess. It's one thing with initializing GitHub repositories is that you should never be embarrassed if you need to take a second stab at it. When I was learning Git, I definitely had a string of times where it kind of took me a while to figure out what the right process was for starting an R project that also worked with GitHub. So if you get to a point, if it's a brand new project, then it doesn't matter. You can just delete and start again. If it's something that you already have some files for, just kind of copy your files someplace safe and then delete the old repository, start a new one, and just try it a time or two until you get it set up the way you want to, and then you can copy your files back into it. So assuming that you have your test repository set up here, we're now ready to start going into RStudio, right? So we've done all of this stuff down through Create Repository. And next, we need to find out where this repository is so that we can tell RStudio. And so you should have this green button somewhere on your screen that says clone or download. And I should say, when you say this verb clone, that's what we call the different copies of a version database. So there's kind of the remote branch, or the remote clone, if you want to call it a clone, on GitHub. And then we're going to create a clone of this GitHub repository and pull it onto our own local computers. All right, so you're working on your own local clone of the repository. And you actually have a few different options here. You can actually just download a zip file. So if someone doesn't use Git or GitHub, or I guess if they're on here, they're on GitHub. But if they don't use Git, you can actually just link someone to your GitHub repository, and they can just download your your whole project folder. Right, so they do have options for not doing things the way that we're going to do them, but this is the better way if you're going to be working on this project. So we see the URL right here, and you can click this button that copies it to your clipboard, and it tells you, yeah, you copied it. And then we're going to open up RStudio again. And once you open RStudio, we're going to create a new project. And so I don't know if you guys have used RStudio projects before, or if you just kind of have it in the default of whatever it opens in, and then you open whichever R script you're working on. But once you start doing things that are a bit more complicated, it's a really good idea actually to use RStudio projects. There are a lot of really handy features. One of them is that you can have the working directory set to wherever this project folder is. And I guess it's kind of essential for using GitHub. But this way, all of say you have this working directory, then if you're in an R script and you need to get to a particular folder, like say I had something in this folder docs. So right now my working directory is in this main folder in R995 module 9. Say in my R script, I wanted to access some data that I had in this folder docs. Then in my R script, instead of typing out the full path name on my own local computer, I can just type out the path name relative to this main project folder. So I could just type docs/data.csv or whatever it's called. And that also makes it play a lot more nicely with your collaborators. so that when they download your R scripts or your R project and open up your R scripts, the path names are relative to wherever they stored it rather than an absolute path on your local computer. They can have it so that it works on their local computer without needing to change the full path. So that's just one of the things that is kind of nice about using our projects. Anyway, if we go up to File, we can select New Project, and you should get this pop-up. And assuming that you were able to get Git working on your computer with RStudio, you should have this option for version control. And so that's what we want to do. We want to check out a project from a version control repository. And then we have the option of using Git or Subversion. We're going to use Git. So click on that. And then here, this first option is the repository URL. So you should have that on your clipboard on your computer, so you can just Command V that or Control V, paste that in. And then you have the option for the project directory name. And this can be anything, but this is going to be the name of the folder on your computer that contains this repository. So it's kind of best practices to call it whatever the repo name is, just to keep things from getting confusing. So I'm just going to call it test repo, and that'll be the name of the folder. And then you can decide where this folder is going to go on your computer. So I'm just going to put it on my desktop, but you can scroll through and put it wherever. So then I click Create Project. You should get a pop-up saying cloning into. That happened really fast because there's nothing there. And so now we have this new R project that is connected to our GitHub repository. And so a couple of things happen right away. If you click on the Git tab, then you should see a couple of files right here. By default, at least on my computer, it always opens to the File tab, so you can double check and make sure that everything looks like it showed up the way that it did. You can see we've got our .gitignore, we have our license file, we have our README, and then we also have our .rproj file. So that's the actual R project file. So looks the same on GitHub. Right now, you see that this .r project file is not on the remote repository on GitHub, and we'll change that in a second. Okay, so the next step is to basically make sure that RStudio is working well and that RStudio on your computer can communicate with GitHub remotely. So we can open up this README file, and you'll notice it's called a markdown file, a .md. That's a file format that you probably have not seen before, really. And basically, it's a really simple text format. So it's just plain text. So all of the characters you see, that's all it is. Files like .doc files, those kind of formats have a lot of hidden characters. So there's a lot of formatting that's incorporated within that. Here, markdown files, it's just simple plain text. And it's a format that it works well with RStudio. It works well with GitHub. So you'll probably come across these. It's easy to convert them. Basically, the formatting is contained within these special characters. So I won't go into the specifics. You can look up Markdown format if you want. But just know it's a plain text format that works well with RStudio and GitHub. So if we open up our README file, we're going to add another line. I think I say specifically, let's add a line with test commit 1. All right, so over here we can say test commit 1 ... And you'll notice RStudio tells you whether you have unsaved changes. So this red file name with the asterisk means that this has not been saved yet. We can save it, click the floppy disk or whatever, Control S. And now we see it's saved. And if we go back to our Git panel, now we see this readme.md that has shown up here. And this M under status means that it's been modified. This double question mark, by the way, you can hover over and it actually tells you. It means it's an untracked file. So Git basically has not been paying attention to this. This is new. It doesn't know what it's supposed to be doing with it. So for our first commit, we've saved. Let's stage. So we can click this checkbox under staged, and you should see this M basically move over from unstaged to staged. If it's on the left, that means it's modified and staged. If it's on the right, that means it's not staged. And then once we've staged, we can click the commit button. And if we click that commit button, then we have the option of committing. So you can actually see here what has changed in whichever file you highlight up here in this panel. So since we're staging and committing just the readme.md file, we want to look at that, and we can see, okay, so I added a space here. That's why it's saying this first line changed. Then I have a blank space, and then test commit 1 ... Right, so I can see what this chunk of the file used to look like and what it looks like now. And then we have our commit message, and we can type in test commit. So we type that in up here in the commit message box, and then you have to click commit again. And you should get a pop-up that says 1 file changed, however many lines insertions, 1 deletion, maybe just 2 insertions, because if you just add lines and don't change that first line, it'll say that. We can click done, and we see up here, your branch is ahead of origin master by 1 commit. So that means basically that compared to the version on GitHub, right, so the kind of remote copy of our repository, we are 1 commit ahead. We've committed once since then, and it hasn't been updated to that remote branch. The way that we do that is by pushing. So we can click this push button, and I have my credentials already stored. You might get a pop-up that asks you to type in your username and password, or maybe just your password. If you do get that, go ahead and type in your username, type in your password. That's for your GitHub account. Once you type that in, then it should push, and it should say to the URL for that Git repository. So basically the same thing, but your username instead of mine, master to master. Okay. So once you've done that, you can close out of that window, and we see actually that the README file is no longer in this little panel. So there's nothing uncommitted, nothing changed but not committed in that file. So at that point, we can look on GitHub. If we refresh, you should see that our README file has changed, so test commit 1. And so we can click on that, and it actually renders it automatically. So when I say that GitHub plays nicely with Markdown files, this is what I mean. So it basically applies the formatting from within the plain text Markdown file into something that's a little bit nicer. So this file is actually all written in Markdown as well. So assuming that has worked for you, and you see this test commit 1 or whatever you typed showing up on GitHub, that means that RStudio is in fact communicating with GitHub, and GitHub is communicating with RStudio. One thing that might seem a little bit annoying is you got asked for your login information when you tried to push. And I would agree with you. That is annoying. You don't want to have to do that every time. If you have that extra step, that's going to make you less likely to use Git, less likely to use GitHub, and less likely to commit and push frequently. So there are basically 2 options for storing your credentials, storing your username and your password. And it depends a bit on whether you're on Windows or Mac or Linux. And so basically, the first way is to just store your username and password. The second is to set up SSH keys. SSH keys are a little bit more complicated to do, but they are more secure. So if that's kind of I don't know, if you're the type of person that is sort of interested in figuring out how all this stuff works, there's a tutorial linked here that will tell you how to do it. I'm not going to go through it. I'm just going to walk through the simpler way. So if you're on Windows, open up the shell again. So remember, that's through RStudio, this little wheel, the gear, down to shell. Open that up. And then once you have the shell open, type in git config dash dash global credential.helper wincred. And so that stands for Windows credentials. Um, and if that doesn't work for you, right, so this is basically telling Git that your credential helper should be wincred. If that throws an error message or it doesn't seem to work after you go through this cycle once, then you can actually download a Git credential manager and run that .exe file, and that should help. Right, so at that point, after you've run this, go ahead and close that shell window and skip down to testing your stored credentials. On a Mac, open up the shell the same way, or if you open up a terminal window, if you've never used terminal, oops, terminal is the kind of default application for Mac that lets you run from the command line. So go ahead and open that up and type in git config dash dash global credential.helper OSX keychain, right? So that's the default kind of password manager on Macintoshes. And then go ahead and close the shell, and then essentially the next step is to test whether or not those stored credentials work. So the way to do that is to try committing again. So we'll go through. You can either add another line here and say test commit to. Go ahead and save that. Stage by clicking this button, right? So the little checkbox under the staged column. Then go up to commit. I'm going to say test commit to, or maybe I'll just say checking credentials. We're going to commit. Sometimes I get that when Git's still thinking. So I committed, closed, and then to actually test whether or not your credentials have been, or whether that is working, you can click push. And that should trigger it to basically ask for your username and password again. So go ahead and type it in. And then once you've typed it in that one time, if everything is working the way that it should work, then that'll be the last time you need to do it, because that'll actually store it with your credentials manager. And then to test whether that worked, you can click pull. And so push is for when you've made changes on your local computer and you want to get it to GitHub. Pull lets you take what's on GitHub and bring it to your local computer. And so if you pull, it should just tell you already up to date. If you get this message, then that means that your credentials have been stored and everything is working. If that's not the case, and you do get asked for your username and password, go ahead and try this again, or maybe try installing Git Credential Manager. And if that doesn't work, then go ahead and go through this tutorial and get your SSH keys set up, and that should work. So at this point, Git and RStudio should be fully configured. They should be talking together nicely, and you should be ready to start a new project on GitHub. So in the next video, we'll go through some of the features of GitHub, and I'll show you a little bit more about how you might use Git if you're working on a project.